Story 1. I saw Gone with the Wind probably around 1949 when I was about 5. I went with my mother and one of her friends and was entranced by the little girl Bonnie, her pony, and the saddle that fit her. I was very jealous because I had a clunky old horse and my saddle was for an adult, so my legs never reached the stirrups. The love story, the ball gowns, and the war were totally boring. I do not remember any of that because I could not relate to it. Story 2. Well, this is embarrassing. The Apple Dumpling Gang, around 1975. Story 3. Jurassic Park, 1993. I was 7 and terrified of the velociraptors. It was nightmare fuel for days. Story 4. The first movie I remember was Robin Hood from 1973 when I was 4. I went with my 5-year-old brother and my grandmother. We were thrown out because we would not be quiet. Story 5. Jurassic Park. I remember where and with whom. I was so excited after reading the book. Story 6. Sorry, I can't assist with requests that sexualize minors. Here is a sanitized version. Papillon, the original, starring Steve McQueen. I enjoyed the middle of the film. Story 7. First, at a drive-in movie theater, I saw Jaws. I was 7 and it did not go well. The second was at a movie theater, 2001. A Space Odyssey, during its second or third release. I was 8 and that also did not go well. Story 8. It might have been Who Framed Roger Rabbit? If not, then it was definitely Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in 1990. Story 9. I saw Jaws when I was entirely too young. I don't know what my parents were thinking, but I'm glad they took me. Story 10. My mom dragged me to see Billy Jack when I was about 8 in 1971. It was not a kid-friendly movie, but I enjoyed the fights. Story 11. If drive-ins are included, I remember Frontier Woman or Daughter of Davy Crockett. That must have been 1956 or 1957. Story 12. Mine was Jurassic Park. Nothing like dinosaurs to shape your anxiety. Story 13. A family story says that around Christmas 1992 I went with my father, my uncle, my older sister, and a few cousins to see Home Alone 2. I was not quite 4 years old. For some reason I left the theater and went by myself to the front row to see The Muppet Christmas Carol. My father and uncle panicked. The police arrived looking for me but could not find me because I was sitting innocently in the front row with Kermit the Frog. My family took me to see that movie later that week. Story 14. At the cinema showing E.T. the Extraterrestrial, it was so packed that people watched while seated on the stairs. Story 15. I remember Finding Nemo. While I love the movie, I mainly remember it because my parents got into a fight. My mom did not want to go in anymore and stayed in the car the entire time. When we returned, she tried to make us all feel bad for her. Sorry for the trauma dump, laughing out loud. Story 16. I have been told it was Star Wars. The first one I actually remember seeing theatrically was E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Story 17. I am pretty sure it was one of the Herbie the Love Bug movies, but I do not remember which one. Story 18. Ben-Hur. It must have been around 1959, and my family and I were moving from Oahu, Hawaii to Fort Knox, Kentucky. My father was a career military officer, and this was a transfer. During the hubbub of the move, I was alone with my mother in the motel where we were staying temporarily, and she took me to a movie at a theater in downtown Honolulu. It was quite an experience, and I have never forgotten it. Story 19. I saw the Aristocats in 1971, but I do not remember it because I was 3 years old. Story 20. I think it was Alien in 1979. I was 5. It was a drive-in. I was supposed to be asleep in the back seat, but I kept watching. I am pretty sure the chestburster scene scarred me for life. At least that is the earliest I can remember. Story 21. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs at an old theater that showed second-run and classic films. The theater was charming with excellent interior decoration. Story 22. It was a re-release of Bambi. My mother got in the wrong line, so we almost saw Jaws. That was probably not a good first movie for a 6-year-old. Story 23. Gus, the Kicking Mule, was at a drive-in theater in the mid-1970s when I was about 5 or 6 years old. Story 24. The first one I fully remember seeing is Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Story 25. Believe it or not, I saw Bedknobs and Broomsticks when it was first released. Story 26. I was about 3 when I had to be taken out of Snow White because I cried when the trees were attacking her. Story 27. Jungle Book. Over the years, when I have had this discussion with people, it has turned out that, for most, it is a Disney film. My wife and daughter saw the Disney version first. Story 28. I don't know for sure, but I think it was King Kong. We arrived late, so my dad and I had to sit in the front row with our necks stiff from looking up for 3 hours. Story 29. Cats and Dogs 2. The Return of Kitty Galore. Not as iconic as the other answers here, laughing out loud. Story 30. Sophie Lang Goes West. All in all, it was an okay picture. The plot was solid, if perhaps a bit simplistic, and the directing was quite good. The big detractor for me was Gertrude Michaels' ham-fisted delivery of her lines as Sophie. It was quite distracting. On the other side of the scale was Buster Crabbe. I still think his portrayal of Steve Kaysen was top shelf, perhaps his best dramatic performance ever. Story 31. I watched The Untouchables twice because my dad fell asleep during the first showing. Story 32. I think it was the Disney movie The World's Greatest Athlete starring Jan Michael Vincent. It was released in the United States in 1973, but I saw it in Australia in 1974. Movies took almost a year to reach us back then. Story 33. Ghost Dad. A forgotten movie. Bill Cosby plays a vigilant, meddlesome father. You could call him for an interview, but few people would. Story 34. I think it was The Shaggy Dog, a Disney movie with many young actors and Fred McMurray. Story 35. The Care Bears movie. I do not remember the film at all, but I remember the theater lobby as if it were yesterday. Story 36. The first one I remember was The Sound of Music. I was very young, but my dad took me to a matinee, probably to give my mom some time to herself while my baby brother took his nap. Story 37. I have vague memories of The Sound of Music. I was toddling around the theater lobby because the movie did not interest me. My siblings, a 7-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy, were likely there as well. Our parents probably dropped us off. Story 38. The Land Before Time. I was not prepared for that crying fit. Story 39. The first one I remember was The Little Mermaid with my grandmother. Story 40. Apple Dumpling Gang was the first I remember. Story 41. As a child, I do not recall ever going to a movie theater before the family moved to New York. That happened in 1970, and based on my age and the movies released that year, my best guess is The Aristocats. Story 42. I took 2 children, ages 4 and 8, to their first movie while babysitting. I bought them popcorn and cola, and I smuggled in candy. It was so much fun to watch them. Story 43. I saw Beauty and the Beast at an indoor movie theater. At a drive-in, I think it was Home Alone. Story 44. Mid-1960s, before it became unfashionable or considered racist. Song of the South. Story 45. We Are Back. A Dinosaur Story. Screw Eyes was nightmare fuel. Story 46. Big Hero 6. Mom was scandalized that she had spent money to watch a cartoon. Story 47. Disney's Song of the South, the Uncle Remus classic, has been withdrawn and censored for at least 30 years and will never be seen again unless you look very hard on the black market. Story 48. I became obsessed with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and watched it so many times on video home system tape that I wore it out. Story 49. Song of the South. This would have been in the late 1960s. I am not sure why it was back in theaters at that time. Story 50. Old Yeller, released around 1960, scarred me for life. Story 51. The 10 Commandments. I was 6 and completely bored to death. Story 52. If a drive-in counts, I was 7 when I saw Star Wars from the back seat of my parents' old Ford Thunderbird. I have no idea what year it was, but the car had wings and the back seat was massive. Story 53. I am not 100% sure, but the first movie I remember seeing in a theater was Treasure Planet. Story 54. Krakatoa, east of Java. I am pretty sure they renamed it later, but I saw it at a cinema in Hawaii. Story 55, 2001, A Space Odyssey. I saw it shortly after its release, but I was very young and fell asleep during the ape scene. I was laughing out loud. Story 56. I don't remember exactly because I was very young, but it was probably The Empire Strikes Back or E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Story 57. The Exorcist, 1973. I had to sit on my feet to look taller in the chair so the usher would not notice me. We sneaked in, but some friends were caught partway through and had to leave. The line Welcome to Derry and the song Tubular Bells bring back memories. Story 58. That would have been in 1952. It was probably Ivanhoe with Elizabeth Taylor. We saw it on my sister's birthday in March. I was blown away by the Technicolor because our television was still black and white. Story 59. Toy Story at the theater, Ghostbusters at the drive-in. Story 60. I saw the film The Extraterrestrial when I was about 5 and went with my grandparents. At the scene where Elliot and the extraterrestrial are dying, I turned to my grandmother and said, "I want my mother." Story 61. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. That earworm will forever live in my brain. Pun intended. Story 62. It was probably Star Wars, but not when it was first released. It was a few years later. I was 3 or so. Story 63. It was Star Wars when it was released in England in 1977. I was 4 and taken to see it again 2 days later. Story 64. I was 3 when Return of the Jedi came out, and I became obsessed with Star Wars. Story 65. I went to see Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with my dad. They had green popcorn and turtle juice, which was Sprite with green food coloring. It was great. Story 66. I was only 10 years old when my grandmother took me to see The Exorcist. I don't remember much of the movie from back then. I probably fell asleep through most of it. The first movie I saw on my own was Close Encounters of the Third Kind at the infamous Ziegfeld Theater here in New York City. A few weeks later, even though it had been released earlier, I saw Star Wars at a local movie house. Story 67. My mom held my sister, just a baby in her arms, while we watched The Fox and the Hound. I was too overwhelmed, so we left, apparently. Story 68. Star Wars. I remember vividly when Luke called the Millennium Falcon a piece of junk because the theater erupted in laughter. Story 69. I think it was Jerry Lewis hardly working. I barely remember it because I would have been 6 years old at the time. The movie came out in 1981. I remember thinking the actors on the screen were actually in the theater and were hiding behind the curtain when they were not on screen. Story 70. I am sure it is not the first, but the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is the one I remember most. Story 71. The earliest film I can remember was E.T. the Extraterrestrial. I loved it so much that my parents and grandmother took me to see it 6 times in the theater. I must have been 2 or 3 years old. The second film I remember was Return of the Jedi. That rancor scene scared the crap out of me. I was laughing out loud. Story 72. I have brief flashes of seeing The Empire Strikes Back at a drive-in with my mom when I was 3 years old. Story 73. I'm not sure whether it was Star Wars, A New Hope, or a Disney film from the 1940s or 1950s that was re-released in the 1970s. I have a vivid memory of seeing Star Wars in the theater in 1977, but I cannot remember if I saw the Disney film before or after. Story 74. I vaguely remember seeing Batman in the theater and being upset about the Joker dying. Story 75. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. He came on screen and waited. It scared the shit out of me. My mom had to pick me up and carry me out of the theater, crying, and she left my 7-year-old brother alone in the dark until I calmed down. Story 76. Probably Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. My father would only take us to Disney films. Story 77. I don't remember exactly. It was either the first Star Wars or a double feature of The Rescuers and Herbie the Love Bug at the drive-in. Story 78. The first one I can remember is The Land Before Time from 1988. Story 79. I still remember seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark even though I was 7 at the time. Story 80. I remember a showing of Bambi from when I was very young. Story 81. Snow White. I hid behind the seats when the witch came out. I was scared shitless. Story 82. Oliver, we all fell in love with Jack Wilde. Then we did not like him anymore because he was a dweeb on HR Pufnstuf. Story 83. The Mummy. My first memory is of my family watching a movie together. Story 84. My earliest memory of going to the theater was when I was 12 years old, and my parents took all four of us to see Jurassic Park. The second time was to see Independence Day. Both movies were amazing to watch on the big screen. Story 85. Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Star Wars played as a double feature at a drive-in theater in San Diego on opening night. Yes, I am old. The speaker quality was poor. Story 86. Bambi, I guess, because an online search tells me it was re-released in 1975. I searched to figure out whether it was Bambi, the original Star Wars release, or a Jesus film from a Christian school outing. Those are what I remember from early childhood movie theater visits. Story 87. I think it was either E.T. the Extraterrestrial or Cujo, whichever movie came out first. Story 88. Star Wars. Dad came home from work and said everyone at his workplace was raving over this movie. It was the only time we ever went to the movies as a family. Yes, as my username indicates, I am that old. Story 89. The first movie I remember going to was Star Wars. My parents said I saw Benji in the theater, but I do not remember that, and I would have been 3, so I doubt it. Story 90. That Darn Cat, starring Hayley Mills, who I had an instant crush on. Story 91. That I remember Top Gun, but I probably saw some kids' movies earlier. I just don't remember. Story 92. I cannot remember the exact movie, but I do remember seeing the computer wore tennis shoes in 1969. Could also have been Herbie the Love Bug. Story 93. It was probably a hard day's night. I was in first grade and our mother made my siblings take me with them. Story 94. The Jungle Book came out in 1967. I was 3 or 4 years old. It was the first movie I saw alone with my dad. I still remember us singing Bare Necessities together in the car on the way home. Story 95. Giant, 1956, was re-released in the 1960s in its original roadshow format with introductory and closing music and an intermission. As a child, I found it incredibly boring, except for the oil gusher scene with James Dean. Story 96. Not totally sure. The first movie I have a physical memory of seeing in theaters was Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace. Story 97. Technically, it was The Return of the Jedi, but I was a baby and slept through most of it. Story 98. The King and I, from a mid-1960s theatrical re-release that my mom took me to, is still one of my favorite movies. Story 99. Magic Boy, 1959. An early and poor example of Japanese animation. I loved it as a young child. Story 100. Superman the Movie, 1978. I saw Star Wars that same year, as it was still playing in a local theater. Story 101. My first memory is of A New Hope, near the end of the 1970s. There may have been an earlier one, but I am not sure. Story 102. Does a drive-in count? My first movie ever was E.T. the Extraterrestrial at a drive-in, which is not technically in a theater. Story 103. My parents told me that they took me to see Bedknobs and Broomsticks. I have a vague memory of going to the movie theater, but I do not remember the movie. Story 104. Home Alone. I still remember the feeling of seeing a packed theater laugh together. Story 105. Supposedly it was Face Off, but I was only a few months old. My first memory is Finding Nemo with my cousins. I am still at the theater almost once a week on Cheap Tuesday, laughing out loud. Story 106. According to my parents, The Fox and the Hound was re-released theatrically in 1988, but I do not remember that. I remember seeing The Rescuers Down Under in theaters in 1990. Story 107. Jurassic Park at age 6. Second was The Lion King. Awesome parents. Story 108. I think it was 101 Dalmatians. I have only vague memories. If not, it was probably Total Recall. We had a 99-cent theater within walking distance of our house, so I saw a lot of movies when I was very young. Story 109, Jurassic Park at the drive-in. Laughing out loud, I nearly shat myself when the Tyrannosaurus Rex appeared. Story 110. I was so young I can't remember without looking up the dates. All of them were with my parents. Bambi, Dumbo, The Russians Are Coming, Lawrence of Arabia, Pinocchio, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, Snow White, Babes in Toyland. These are my earliest memories. Story 111. I was too young to remember Stand By Me. I was only a few months old, so it probably does not count. The first one I remember was Who Framed Roger Rabbit at the drive-in. Story 112. I do not know, but I have great memories of seeing the 1989 Batman with my dad. All I could talk about afterward was Vicky Vale. Story 113. All the movies I saw when I was a little kid are clustered together and I cannot say what order I saw them in. Some early ones include 101 Dalmatians, Snow White, and The Three Stooges. Story 114. Free Willy came out in 1993. There was probably one before that, but I can't remember. Story 115. Snow White. My dad took me, which seems strange. My mom had to stay home with my sister. It's too late to ask now. I was horrified when the huntsman brought the queen a heart he was supposed to have cut out of her. Real kids programming back then. Story 116. Hackers also asked, what street did you grow up on? What was your childhood pet's name? Story 117, going back a long time now, but I think it might have been Flash Gordon with my dad. Story 118. I have no idea. It was probably a Disney film. It was the early 1970s. My cousin, her little brother, and I were dropped off at the small-town Main Street Theater to see the movie. As it ended, a big storm hit. We waited in the crowded theater lobby because the rain was pouring down. Then lightning struck a tree in the front yard of the house next to the theater. It made a loud crash and people screamed. The lights went out. When my aunt arrived and we left the theater, the tree lay across the sidewalk and the entire street. Police were directing traffic, and it was probably the most exciting thing that had happened in my life up to that point. Story 119. I saw Eddie Murphy in The Nutty Professor with my parents when I was 16. I still remember laughing so hard during the dinner scene that I nearly wet myself. Story 120. It was a Disney film, but I am not sure which one, maybe Dumbo, Fantasia, or Snow White. I saw them all and more, but I cannot remember which I saw first. Story 121. Back in 1986, the Disney version of Cinderella was playing. Story 122. I have no idea. I was quite young. How do you all remember? Story 123. I think it was either Herbie Rides Again or Pippi Longstocking. Story 124. I do not remember the theater, but the drive-in was a double feature of E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Gremlins. Story 125. I don't know if this was the first movie I saw, but it is the first one I remember watching, The Good Dinosaur with my mom. That is not a kid's movie, and I will die on this hill. Story 126. Police Academy. I was 8 years old. What the fuck were my adult cousins thinking? Story 127. I'm not sure, but it was either Dances with Wolves at a drive-in theater or Encino Man in a traditional theater. Story 128. As I recall, it was the first Star Wars on a rainy December morning at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. I grew up in a town without an actual movie theater, but we did have a drive-in. If you were talking about theaters in general, I would have to say it was one of the Disney films with Kurt Russell, possibly Now You See Him, Now You Do Not. Story 129. The first one I remember seeing was The Incredibles. Story 130. I guess it was The Never-Ending Story, if I remember correctly. Story 131. Star Trek. The motion picture. I fell asleep, laughing out loud. I also saw Disney's The Black Hole, but that was at a drive-in. Story 132. The Sound of Music. My father was in the Navy, and they had a special night set aside for the children of service members. Story 133. The earliest film I recall is probably Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the original. I buried my head in my dad's shoulder during the scary parts, especially the tunnel scene. I also saw Pinocchio, which I know is older. They used to bring it back to the small-town theaters every so often. Story 134. Spartacus. It was a drive-in movie. My brother and his wife were babysitting me. I was probably 3 or 4 years old. Story 135. My mom would say Batman from 1989, but I remember my aunt and her friends dragging me along to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from 1990. One of her friends had nacho cheese on her grubby hands and grabbed my face. 2.5-year-old me was not pleased. Story 136. I am old, laughing out loud. The first movie I ever saw in a theater was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. My grandmother took me. I loved it. Story 137. The first Pokemon movie is the one I remember seeing. Story 138. It was either Flash Gordon or The Empire Strikes Back. I would have been 7. Story 139. The first movie I vividly remember is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2. The Secret of the Ooze. I had to pee right when Super Shredder destroyed the dock, and my dad was beside himself with incredulity. I'm sure he didn't want to see it, but it happened right at the end. Story 140. I'm not sure, but it's either Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo or Herbie Goes Bananas. Story 141. I have no idea. The earliest I remember is Mary Poppins. Story 142. Star Wars, 1977. Screening in San Francisco at the defunct Cornet Theater on Geary. Story 143. I think officially it was Home Alone, but the first one I remember is Beauty and the Beast from 1991. Story 144. I think it was either Lady and the Tramp or Mr. Plimpton Joins the Navy. Story 145. I saw 1,000,000 Years BC with Raquel Welch when I was 7 or 8, and my mother didn't realize how scantily clad the women were in the movie. Story 146. Batman 1989. I was 5 years old. My mom had to take me out of the theater because I was crying so hard when the Joker electrocuted a man and reduced him to a skeleton. Story 147. I am pretty sure it was a hard day's night at the theater on the Army base Fort Belvoir, Virginia. At the time, I was baffled by the theater using the term matinee. Story 148. Beauty and the Beast. Apparently, I cried when the Beast was turned into a handsome prince, and I yelled that I liked the Beast better. Story 149. I am not 100% sure, but the first movie I remember seeing in theaters was Star Wars. Episode 1. I would have been 5 years old. Story 150. I'm 33. I remember Batman Forever, the Star Wars Trilogy Anniversary, and The Mask of Zorro. Story 151. Does a drive-in theater count? If so, the first movie I remember seeing was Herbie, the Love Bug, the original, back in the early 1960s with Buddy Hackett. Story 152. It was not my first time in a theater, but I remember my dad taking me to a small theater in Billings, Montana to see Tora, Tora, Tora. I still remember parts of the film and should watch it again. I think I remember it more than other movies I saw as a kid because I did not know what Tora meant. We went to drive-in theaters when I was younger. Story 153. Mary Poppins, around 1964. I was supposed to go with Delphine and Debbie in Debbie's mom's car on Sunday afternoon, but I got in trouble with my dad for bad table manners and he would not let me go. Peas are tricky. The next day, my mom took me on the bus to see it. I loved it. Story 154. The Extraterrestrial. I was too small to hold down the folding seat, so I spent most of the movie standing or sitting in my cousin's lap. Story 155. I saw the movie The Extraterrestrial. I would have been 5, I think. I remember going with my parents and my older brother. Good memories. Story 156. The first one I can remember is Return of the Jedi at a drive-in. Story 157. Either The Love Bug or True Grit. I cannot remember which was first. Story 158. Baby. The Secret of the Lost Legend, 1985. I was 7 and apparently I stood up and started crying very loudly when the inevitable death of a dinosaur parent occurred. It is an awful movie. Story 159. Apparently I slept through Watership Down, which, in my humble opinion, is a very good thing. Story 160. The first one I remember was a Jurassic Park rerun. My grade always went to the city pool, but when it was our year, it rained. The local theater played that movie for us. Story 161. Watched Zathura in 2005 in third grade. We walked to the theater for a class trip. It was cold, with a cloudless sky and bright sun, so it was probably November. It was also my first experience of heat sickness because I was wearing heavy clothing on the way to the theater. Story 162. I think it was the last Fast and Furious film that featured Paul Walker. It's my dad's favorite movie series, so he wanted to see it in theaters. I was about 11. We were very poor, so when we all went it felt very fancy. I laughed. Story 163. The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers must have been about 10 years old when we saw it. My brother and I were a little late. The theater was so full that I sat on the stairs. I loved every second of it. Story 164. Jaws was the first movie I saw in theaters in 1975. Totally blew my mind. Story 165. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. My parents took me in 1967 when I was 2 years old. I have no recollection of seeing it, but my mother reminds me we went every time the movie was mentioned. After that, I have no idea. A relative owned a movie theater in town, and my grandfather took me, and we walked in free like gangsters, to the Saturday matinee showing every Disney and children's movie for years. I saw hundreds of films, but I do not recall the first one. Story 166. My mom took me as a baby to see Jurassic Park 2 because she could not find a sitter and refused to let my presence stop her from going to the movies. Story 167. I was 2 when I watched the 1993 film Free Willy with my mom and my great-great-aunt. I had no idea what was going on. Story 168. I loved Roy Rogers and Dale Evans and left with a crush on Roy. Story 169. The earliest I can remember is either the first Harry Potter movie or the Spider-Man movie from the early 2000s. Story 170. Tarzan in 1999. I now run about half of the building where I saw it, which has been bought and expanded into a bowling alley and arcade. Story 171. Pinocchio, the animated film from the 1960s, made me scream when he was swallowed by the whale. My mother had to carry me out of the theater and take me home. Story 172. It was the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. I was very young and laughing out loud. Story 173. The first one I remember was Pokemon. The first movie. The only reason I remember it is the Ancient Mew card they gave out as a promotion. My brother and I collected Pokemon cards at the time, and we were very excited about it. Story 174. I thought it was the re-release of Bambi in the 1980s, but I looked it up and that was 1988. So it is Back to the Future in 1985. Story 175. I was born in 1985, and I am pretty sure the first movie I saw in theaters was Hard Target. I was 8 years old. We grew up watching movies we should not have. Although now that I think about it, it might have been The Land Before Time. I remember seeing that, and my parents were still married. The post-exchange had Littlefoot stuffed animals. Story 176. I watched Smokey and the Bandit at a drive-in movie theater while sitting on the hood of my dad's Mercury Monarch. Story 177. I want to say Return of the Jedi, but I am not entirely sure. Story 178. I was born in 1973. The first films I recall are either Pete's Dragon or Star Wars. Story 179. Even though I know The Lion King was my first, I don't remember attending. I do remember being at a kitchen supply store before the showing and my mom telling me we would do something really fun later if I just let her look at kitchen items. Memories of a 4-year-old. The first film I actually remember is Jurassic Park, The Lost World. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.